Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. In this podcast, I wanted to make a counter critique to the critique which was made by the Red Plains Revolutionary Group out of Nebraska of Maoism-Third Worldism. The critique by that group was made on the Revolutionary Left Radio podcast, which is a rather interesting podcast. I would encourage you to watch some episodes of it. I think that the interviewers do a pretty good job of asking good questions. And so I have nothing against them at all. I respect the work that they have done in the past, and I wish them success in the future. My critique is certainly not of them. My critique is of the Red Plains Revolutionary Group. But again, I have nothing against them either. I'm simply providing a response video to the podcast that they made critiquing people like me. I think that they made a number of mistakes, and it is those mistakes that I will focus upon in this podcast. First, they made a statement that Maoist third worldists reject the idea that there is a proletariat in the first world. I have no idea where they got that from. That is simply not true as far as I know. Now, is it possible that some Maoist third worldist might have said that or something like it? I suppose so. I have never heard anybody say that, but it may just be that I have not watched some person. Either way, I think that they would have produced a better presentation had they listened to a variety of different voices from the Maoist third worldist community prior to doing this interview. I think that they made a mistake by simply relying upon what I regard as incomplete information. Certainly, there is a proletariat in the first world. I consider myself to be a member of the proletariat, albeit a relatively economically successful one. I also know of many proletarians who are Maoist third worldists who are not as successful as I am, and I can't imagine any of them denying it. Why would they? Why would somebody who is a proletarian who fits the definition of proletarian given by Karl Marx say, I'm not a proletarian? That makes no sense to me. So I think that they confuse two different things. Although there is a proletariat in the first world, it's very small. For example, I look here in the United States. Where do we see the greatest number of proletarians concentrated? MAGA, the Make America Great Again movement, started by the neo-fascist, or inspired at least by the neo-fascist Donald Trump, who might very well become once again the president of the United States in January 2025. Not to say Joe Biden would be any better or has been much better, but that might happen again. And a lot of these people in MAGA are supporting Trump. That is why Trump, despite the fact that he has not participated in any of the Republican debates, is still leading all of his Republican challengers by a mile. Literally none of them appears at this point to have a shred of a chance of defeating Donald Trump. Donald Trump appears to be the undisputed leader of the pack. What happens if Trump goes to prison? I don't know. It's possible he might go to prison and still be elected. That will produce, I think, a constitutional crisis in the US, which would ultimately have to be resolved, I assume, by the Supreme Court. But certainly there is a proletariat in the United States. At least there are people who could be in the proletariat in the United States, but they're not. They're not. The workers who should be in the proletariat are MAGA. Instead, they are lumpen proletarians, meaning they are workers without class consciousness. Proletarians are workers with class consciousness. Again, we have both in the United States. But if you look at the proportionality, at least from my own observations, speaking as a PhD in sociology, I don't see any evidence that there is a huge amount of proletarians in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere else in the first world. I do see a large number of lumpen proletarians in the first world. I should qualify that when I talk about the lumpen proletariat, I am not referring to the subaltern. The subaltern, which can also be called the fourth world, is a term coined by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. He referred to a class which is below the proletariat, a class which is basically poor. In effect, the subaltern could be seen as the underclass. We do have a subaltern in the United States, but the subaltern is much larger in the third world. Poverty in general is larger in the third world. So I think that the mistake that the Red Plains Revolutionary Group made was to assume that because Maoist third worldists do not think that revolution will start in the first world, that therefore we reject the idea that there is a proletariat in the first world. That is simply not the case. Simply not the case. I don't understand why they came to that conclusion. My guess is either a misreading of the literature or they got secondhand information. That's the best explanation I can come up with. Regardless, what they said is not true. Speaking as a Maoist third worldist, I affirm the existence of a proletariat as well as a lumpen proletariat, much larger lumpen proletariat in the first world. But the question is the proletariat in the first world sufficiently large to conduct a revolution? Or to put it another way, is there a large enough degree of dialectical potential here in the first world to produce a revolution? To that, I would say no. At least, I don't think so. Now, I am not infallible. I could be wrong, but all I can do is tell you what I observe. If you find evidence to the contrary, please, and I mean this sincerely, produce a response video. Link that response video below this podcast. If you're not comfortable making a podcast on your own, make a comment. I will respond to your comment. I am a nice guy. I am used to dealing with people who don't agree with me. All professors and retired professors like myself are used to it because we spend our careers dealing with students and in many cases other faculty members as well, including in our own departments, who disagree with us. So we are accustomed to disagreement. I have no problem with anybody disagreeing with me. In fact, I enjoy it. I enjoy dialoguing with people who have different points of view. Now, that said, when I look around the world today, I do see that there is some evidence of a greater or larger proletariat in the third world. Now, why do I say that? I say that based upon what has happened. There have been, in the 21st century, attempts at revolution in Iraq, in Mexico, and in the Philippines. Now, not all of those revolutions were Marxist, but all of them were leftist. So at least there's evidence that there is the potential of revolution. In Iraq, for example, actual communities were established. Sadly, those communities were destroyed by Turkey. Has Turkey suffered any consequences? No, of course not. Why would anyone think that they would? That's the way the world is. The first world has all the power. The third world basically has none. And that is the way the world has been for quite a long time. And I don't expect it to change tomorrow. So I am not passing the buck. I recognize, however, that the third world appears to me, anyway, to have more dialectical potential than the first world. Okay? It appears to me. I don't, however, feel as though there is nothing that we can do here in the first world. For example, in making this podcast, in engaging in conscientization, hopefully, through this podcast, I am trying to participate in some kind of revolutionary activity. I realize it is minimal. I realize it is indirect because I am not literally in the third world. I am 2 miles from it. I'm 2 miles from Mexico, so I'm pretty darn close to it, but I'm not in it. I go there. I have a good friend in Mexico that I see when I go to his shop, but I don't live there. So I admit to not having constant experience living in the third world, but I see how people live down there. I see the kinds of homes people live in, really, really dilapidated homes. When I was in Congo, I saw people with bloated bellies walking down the streets. When you walk down the main street in Kinshasa, you see dead bodies literally lining the streets. At first, I thought they were maybe sleeping. So I asked my companion, hoping he would say yes, are they sleeping? He said, no, they're dead. What do you say to that? Well, that the third world is in much worse shape than the first world. In the first world, despite all of the problems that we have, relative to the third world, we in the first world are spoiled. We are spoiled. We have so much in terms of money, in terms of food, in terms of resources. Hardly anyone ever dies of starvation in the first world. Does it happen? Yeah, it happens. Does it happen often? No. Does it happen a lot in the third world? You bet. You bet. It happens a lot in the third world. The third world has nowhere near the amount of financial assets that we have here in the first world. The times when third world countries have tried to break the hold that the first world has on them have generally failed. There have been some successes. For example, Fidel was an attempt was, well, put it another way, an attempt was made to kill the guy. Fortunately, it was unsuccessful. Then another attempt was made to kill the guy. Fortunately, it was unsuccessful. Then another attempt was made, and that was unsuccessful as well. So fortunately, Fidel survived. That was not the case in Iran in 1953, when Mossadegh was elected the president of Iran, democratically elected the president of Iran, and in documents that have been declassified by the CIA, the US now admits that it went in to Iran to overthrow the government of Iran and to put in power Shah Pahlavi. That was our own doing right here in the US. We did not want Iran to become self-sufficient, especially with respect to oil. Oil was the major issue, the major reason why the US cared about Iran. So when during the Great Revolution in Iran in 1979, which I remember well, I followed it on a daily basis. The Iranians shouted, "Death to America. America is the great Satan." A lot of Americans had no context for it. Why do they hate us so much? Because Iranians know their history. We may have forgotten ours, especially our recent history, but Iranians have not forgotten theirs. They know what we did to them and what we are continuing to do to the third world, how we are continuing to repress the third world. They see in Mexico, for example, how these cartels are allowed to run roughshod over the entire population practically in Mexico, and nobody tries to help them. Americans are warned by the United States government not to travel into Mexico. I live right near Reynosa, Mexico, which is one of the major hubs of cartel activity in that country. There are constant warnings by the State Department. Do not go to Reynosa. What do? They blow up cars. They blow up homes, which obviously homes of people who are from Reynosa. They capture Americans, primarily looking for a ransom. If they don't get the ransom, they will often decapitate those people and do it very, very slowly. And that is the life that people have in that country. But a year ago, I had a conversation with a Mexican guy at a fair. We have a fair right here in the Rio Grande Valley called PalmFest. And I was sitting next to him, and at first I asked him if he spoke English. He said no. I suspect he was suspicious of me, understandably. He didn't know who I was. But we gradually got along, and he started smiling, and we ended up having a nice conversation. I asked him a question, and maybe I shouldn't have asked him this because I really knew what the answer would be. And I said, "Do you like living in Mexico?" Maybe that was a foolish thing to ask him, but I felt like it was just a question that came into my head, so I asked him. And he said, "No, it is very, very dangerous." That's what everyone says. I know Mexican Americans who have relatives in Mexico that they haven't seen in 30 years because of the cartels. It is dangerous going back and forth right along the border. Members of cartels are waiting there for people. Now, do most people get killed? No, but you don't have to kill that many to frighten the population. So that's the problem. The third world is oppressed. There is, in my view, more class consciousness in the third world. And so I think that the chances of revolution are greater in the third world than they are right here in the first world. Does that mean there is a guarantee of revolution in the third world or anywhere else? No. But at least I think there is hope. Also, to counter another of the misconceptions of the Red Plains Revolutionary Group of Nebraska, they argued that that Maoist third worldists don't think that the first world will even be a part of revolution. I have no idea where they got that idea from. No idea. First, I consider myself as participating in revolution, however minimally, by engaging in conscientization, by participating in making these podcasts, for example. That's at least something I can do. It may be minimal, but it's something. And perhaps at some point in the future, perhaps the first world can join the third world. So I don't simply pass the buck. I don't have that kind of colonialist mentality where I'm going to put all the burden on the third world and say I don't have any responsibility at all. Far from it. I am anti-colonialist. I am anti-imperialist. I am anti-hegemonic. I oppose all of those things, which is why I hope that the third world can eventually, by some means, free itself from the stifling grip of the first world. Do I know if that will happen? No. Do I hope that will happen? Yes. Do I know if the first world will survive long enough to join the third world? No. Do I hope it will? Yes. So, in other words, all of the arguments that I heard in that podcast by Red Plains Revolutionary Group of Nebraska were flawed. They were literally all based on misconceptions of Maoism-Third Worldism. So I would encourage all of you to listen to that podcast. The discussion of Maoism-Third Worldism begins, if you only want to watch or listen to, I should say, the first part of it, about a quarter of the way through the podcast. And then it goes maybe for about 10 or 15 minutes or so. So if that's all you want to hear, you can listen to just that part. That's the only part that directly deals with Maoism-Third Worldism. So again, there will be a link to that podcast. There will also be a link to the Revolutionary Left Radio podcast there, and there will be a link to the Red Plains Revolutionary Facebook page. So both of those things will be linked directly below that podcast. I would encourage you to examine those materials for yourselves. If you find that I made any mistakes, if you find any flaws in my presentations, please point them out to me. I promise that I will be nice and respectful. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.